Here we are again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. We are continuing with our series expounding the divine preservation of the New Testament text. Now I want to talk about pattern and dependency. When 100% of the known manuscripts are in agreement, the pattern and dependency among the manuscripts is total or complete. Since all manuscripts received common influence from the original, it is the divergences that require special attention. When 100% of the known manuscripts are in agreement, there can be no reasonable question as to the original wording. This is probably true for at least 50% of the words of the New Testament. For many more of the words, only one manuscript disagrees. We call this a singular reading. I agree with E.C. Colwell when he declared that all singular readings should be rigorously excluded from consideration, even when a given reading is not an obvious mistake. It is simply unreasonable to imagine that a single manuscript could be correct against 1,700 in the Gospels or against 700 in Paul. When all lines of transmission are in agreement, they must reflect the original. If the manuscript containing a singular variant belongs to a line of transmission, that variant cannot be correct. It is internal to that line. Manuscripts that are so individually disparate that they cannot be grouped do not belong to any line of transmission. Any singular that they contain cannot be correct. The number of manuscripts containing the New Testament is so vast that any disparate manuscript was simply someone's private property. It is irrelevant to the history of the transmission of the text. When two or more manuscripts agree in a divergence, at least three questions need to be asked. 1. Were they produced in the same place? 2. Is it an easy copying mistake that different copyists could make independently? 3. Do they belong to the same line of transmission? When two or more manuscripts share a number of variants in common, there is probably some dependency. They share a common influence of some sort. The extent of such influence requires scrutiny. Colwell opined that two manuscripts should agree at least 70% of the time where there is variation, in order to be classed as representatives of the same family. I would require 80%. Since codices Aleph and B agree less than 70% of the time, they fall below Colwell's threshold. That said, however, it cannot be denied that those two manuscripts suffered a common contamination, to be joined in varying degrees by codices A, C, D, and W. That common contamination must have had a source. Where? Within the discipline of New Testament textual criticism, that common contamination is called the Alexandrian text type. Since Alexandria is in Egypt, that text type is also called Egyptian. Each of the 6 codices mentioned above has a distinct conglomerate of variants. They are each rather different from all the others. Since they each have neither parents nor children that we know of, they are individual productions, fabricated copies. We have no way of knowing what motivated each of the copyists who produced those fabricated copies. However, our ignorance on that point does not change the nature of those fabricated copies. Years ago, Colwell demonstrated that it is impossible to define an archetypal form for the so-called Alexandrian text type based on a vote of the participating manuscripts. A text type without an archetype is a fiction. That said, however, the common contamination attributed to Alexandria is not a fiction. Before he died, Kurt Aland, that great champion of the Egyptian text, wrote that in 200 AD, the Gnostic presence and influence in Egypt was so pervasive that the manuscripts in Egypt could not be trusted. He also wrote that at that time the use of Greek in Egypt was dying out. So on what basis did he claim that the Egyptian text was the best? Based on the objective evidence available to us, it seems to me that the production of manuscripts in Alexandria and environs was never more than a stagnant eddy on the fringe of the great river of New Testament transmission. The surviving manuscripts supposed to have been produced there are so disparate that they do not qualify as a line of transmission. Since we have the names of at least 11 Gnostic denominations in Egypt in 200 AD, there was doubtless no lack of fabricated copies among them. The great age of a fabricated copy does not alter the fact that it is a fabricated copy. A fabricated copy is irrelevant to the history of the transmission of the text. Frederick Vissa collated and compared 1,386 manuscripts in Luke 1, 10, and 20. That's 3 complete chapters. He reduced those manuscripts to 37 groups or families, plus 89 mavericks, that he called them, mavericks, manuscripts that are so individually disparate that they cannot be grouped. It happens that 36 of the 37 groups fall within the broad Byzantine river of transmission. Vissa found 70 subgroups within the 36, so he felt able to define those relationships based on the profiles. The 37th group is the Alexandrian, to which he assigned precisely 10 manuscripts for the 3 chapters. 10 out of 1,386. Just what one might expect for a stagnant eddy. Vissa used pattern and dependency. Herman C. Hoskier collated about 220 manuscripts for the Apocalypse and assigned them to 9 families or groups based on their affinities. For the purposes of the following discussion, I will assign them letters A through I, that is to say, his 9 groups. The critical apparatus of my Greek text, Family 35, for the Apocalypse, based on Hoskier's collations, treats about 954 variant sets. I did a rough and ready count of all the internal divisions within the 9 families, as given in my apparatus. For my present purpose, precision is not necessary. I now list the families in descending order of the number of divisions. Group E, 495 divisions. I, 424. H, 412. A, 268. G, 191. D, 163. B, 135. F, 104. C, 20. That's 20. The total is 2,121, which gives an average of 2.3 per variant set. That's an awful lot of variation, okay? But strange to relate, in spite of all that fuzz, each of the groups has enough private property to permit identification. The top 3 have division around half the time. Let's go back and look at that. There are 954 variant sets. E has 495 variations. That's more than half. I has 424. Well, that's a little under half. And H has 412. That's also a little under half. But that's altogether too much. Now A has 268. It's by far the largest group, and Hoskier identified 5 subgroups within it. So the high number should not surprise us. The number for the last one, C, is remarkably small compared to the others. It happens that group C equals my family 35 and is perhaps the second largest group. I wish to explore the question, what do pattern and dependency tell us about the evidence presented above? But first, I wish to analyze the family 35 divisions. There are 11 numbers that are either spelled out or represented by the appropriate letters of the numbers, like 1, 2, 3. Since these are two ways of saying the same thing, they are not variants, and I did not count them. 9 are alternate spellings of the same word. I did count these, but they are not proper variants. For 8 of them, the difference is of a single letter, and the other is a diphthong. That leaves 11 proper variants, 5 of which involve a single letter, and 3 a diphthong. Only 1 involves more than 2 letters. In short, family 35 is very solid, internally coherent, much more so than any of the other groups. The proper variants involve only 19 letters for the whole book of Revelation. That is astonishing. So what do pattern and dependency tell us about the evidence presented above? I begin with the following postulates. 1. When 100% of the known manuscripts are in agreement, the pattern and dependency among the manuscripts is total. 2. All manuscripts received common influence from the original. 3. All singular readings should be rigorously excluded from consideration. 4. Any idiosyncratic manuscript was simply someone's private property, a fabricated copy. It is irrelevant to the history of the transmission of the text. 5. Fragments do not contain enough text to permit classification, and like idiosyncratic manuscripts are therefore irrelevant to the history of the transmission of the text. However, both fragments and idiosyncratic manuscripts demonstrate that any variants they contain existed at the time they were produced. They demonstrate existence, not value. Just existence, not value. Since all the extant manuscripts from the first 5 centuries in Revelation are either fragments or idiosyncratic, I will confine my analysis to the lines of transmission. And the lines of transmission are in the minuscules. To begin, Hosker used pattern and dependency to identify his 9 groups. But obviously they cannot all represent the original, except when all are in agreement. Do we have 9 independent groups, or can some of the groups be grouped? I went through my apparatus and listed all the different combinations among the 9 groups, with the number of times each combination occurred. That is to say, a combination of 2 or more groups. I found 238 different combinations among the 9 groups. I counted only full groups, no divisions, except that I considered 2/3 or more to represent the full group. Because of the inordinate amount of fuzz, the statistics that I offer can only be a rough approximation, but they are good enough to allow defensible conclusions. However, 96 of the combinations occur only once, and 42 only twice. So I excluded them from the following tabulation. That still leaves 100. I am pleased to note that the recent Text und Textwort for the Apocalypse, published in 2017, recognizes their computation text as an independent line of transmission, along with the so-called Koine and Andreas text. The computation is my family 35, by the way. It corresponds to group C below. Their Koine corresponds to groups A, B, F, G, I, all 5 of those, A, B, F, G, I below. Their Andreas corresponds to groups D, E, H below. Well, that is to say, according to my evaluation. As you can see below, there is a good deal of promiscuity. The individual groups move around, some more than others. The most difficult case is H, that goes with the Koine almost as often as with Andreas. Based on my analysis of Hoskier, the groups have the following size. A is represented by 65 manuscripts, B by 10 manuscripts, C by 33, D by 15, E by 31, F by 11, G by 9, and H by 13, and I by 11. I should note that A all by itself is larger than B, F, G, I combined. D is smaller than E, but E is by far the most fragmented group. Since I consider C to be the common denominator, I place it first. A leads the Koine group and D the Andreas group. Let me just go back, though, and comment on something. According to Hoskier, Group C is represented by 33 manuscripts. But several years ago, I spent some time at the Institute in Münster and personally checked microfilms of manuscripts, and I added 10 to the 33. So now I have 43 manuscripts that represent C, or my family 35, except that one is a fragment, very small fragment, but it contains the first diagnostic family reading. Now I have here a chart. Those who want to study it are going to have to ask for a copy of the file, the text. Otherwise, you can't manage it here. There are 100 different combinations here, 100 different combinations. I'll just go on and discuss it now. Please remember that I have not listed 138 further combinations that occur only once or twice. Now, the amount of mixture is bewildering. In spite of all that, for at least 80 years, the following canard has been standard fare within the discipline. The complutensian group is a composite based on the Koine and Andreas groups. That's the canard. But I ask, how does that idea square with the evidence given above? Group C occurs in no fewer than 129 combinations with other groups, quite apart from the times when it is alone. However, it is almost never entirely alone. A sprinkling of unrelated manuscripts will agree with it. Please note, the roster of such manuscripts is always different. If the roster were the same, such manuscripts would be part of the family. The incredible range of unrelated associations permits two conclusions. One, the manuscripts that represent the group can be identified and factored out, giving us an empirically defined family. Two, that empirically defined family must be independent of all other lines of transmission. And here I'm talking precisely about group C, or my family 35. So, what do pattern and dependency tell us about the evidence? They operate at two levels: within a group and between groups. Within a group, they define the level of consistency or internal coherence exhibited by that group. Thus, among the 9 groups in the Apocalypse, E, I, and H exhibit the most internal confusion. Almost half the time I mention that, which reduces their credibility as lines of transmission. A is large, but it has 5 subgroups. Without the subgroups, A drops from 65 representatives to 18. The 5 subgroups, plus further internal confusion, detract from its credibility as a line of transmission. That's Group A. In contrast to the rest, Group C is remarkably solid, internally consistent or coherent. The internal pattern and dependency are heavy, which enhances the group's credibility as a line of transmission. But how about between groups? It is the comparatively high level of pattern and dependency that allows us to group A, B, F, G, I, and to say that together they form a text type that we may call Koine. The same obtains for groups D, E, H that we may call the Andreas text. In contrast to those 8, group C is independent of them all, as shown by the lack of pattern and dependency. C and Koine agree against Andreas over 100 times, while C and Andreas agree against Koine over 100 times. The complete roster of Koine and Andreas agrees against C just 11 times. I submit that the most reasonable explanation for the evidence before us is that group C is the common denominator. It is the core of the transmission from which all the others departed, at different times and different ways. So, what do pattern and dependency tell us? They permit us to identify groups or families of manuscripts. They also define the level of internal consistency of each group. The lack of pattern and dependency permits us to identify independent lines of transmission. All manuscripts receive common influence from the original, but evidently independent lines of transmission cannot represent the original equally. That should be obvious. I'll repeat it. Evidently, independent lines of transmission cannot represent the original equally. So what do we do when confronted with several such lines? Or, to take a concrete case, how can we choose between Koine, Andreas, and complutensian in Revelation? If we follow 2 against 1, we will have a majority text. As a guess, such a text will be at least 90% complutensian, because it is seldom alone. From my point of view, that would be a very good text. Attention. There is not one single clear 3-way split in the whole book, and only one that might be said to come fairly close. You'll find that in chapter 15, verse 4. So what does the lack of 3-way splits tell us? It tells us that the 3 groups are not equally independent. It tells us that the complutensian is the most independent of the 3. Independent, that is, with reference to the other 2. Since all 3 are dependent on the original, can we determine which one is most dependent and therefore closest to the original? If the evidence points to complutensian as the common denominator, then the other 2 groups are at least partly dependent upon it. This would mean that complutensian lies between them and the original, and is therefore closest to the original. But what about the few places where Koine and Andreas agree against complutensian? Did they do an end run and go back directly to the original? I ask, but how could that be possible? Did they pick and choose, consulting an exemplar different from the complutensian? Such an exemplar would be a node above Koine and Andreas, since they both subsequently went their separate ways. I suppose that would at least be possible. But what if complutensian correctly represents the original? Then a stemma would perhaps look like this. This one is small enough where you can maybe see it. Here's the original. Then I have a node here which I call macro C, and C comes right straight down. Off to one side you have the node that is A and D, A being the Koine group and D being the Andreas group, and then they subsequently divided. Each went their separate ways. That would be a possible stemma. To conclude, I suppose that one's final choice will be guided by considerations beyond pattern and dependency. But we need pattern and dependency to get us close to a final choice. For now.